even if you're really busy, you've got a lot of pressure on you to bill, mark time out and look at your business development time, whatever you use it for. And you have to understand that while you may bill $400 an hour to a client, your business development time is actually worth exponentially more. It's not a waste of time just because you can't bill it to a client. And you've got to carve it out and you have to commit to it.
Welcome to Spill the Ink, a podcast by Reputation Inc., where we feature experts in growth and brand visibility for law firms and architecture, engineering, and construction firms. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Calcote King. I'm your host, and I'm also the principal and president of Reputation Inc. We're a public relations and content marketing agency for law firms and other professional services firms. To learn more, go to rep-inc, that's inc with a K.com. So as a business owner, you're constantly eyeing growth opportunities and thinking through what you can do best to position your business for success. Well, like it or not, a law firm is a business. And if you don't have a clear vision for the future with measurable markers of success, you're essentially just treading water. The strategic planning process is a crucial component to securing your practice. But how should you go about it? And so to talk about this topic, I've invited Wendy Merrill to be on today's episode. Wendy is the Director of Strategic Consulting for Affinity Consulting Group, where she helps law firms with strategic planning for growth and improving profitability. She's a published author and a seasoned business developer and marketer. So I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Hey,
Welcome.
Great to see you.
So Wendy and I know each other well, but I'd love for you to, and I gave that very brief intro, but if you wouldn't mind for the audience giving us a little bit more about your background, tell us about your book and kind of your services at Affinity.
Sure. So many questions, so many things to talk about. So I have been, I'd say, immersed in the legal space for over 12 years. Both as a business development strategist, growth strategist, and also helping firms with their retention needs and their professional development needs and all sorts of really fun and exciting things, really helping law firms to think more like businesses, which is what I love to do. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a book that was specifically written for rising leaders. So those that are a little bit newer, a little bit younger in the professional services space, especially law firms who have aspirations to be impactful, really want to make a difference, want to take on leadership positions, want to grow their firms, but aren't really sure how to start. So that's what it was designed for. So that's called Path to Impact, the Rising Leaders Guide to Growing Smart.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So let's talk about strategic planning. So why should firms care about it, whether they're small or large? Tell me about that.
Well, I want to put it in the post-COVID perspective. I think that that's probably most relevant now because COVID, it continues. We'd like to think we're in post-COVID, but it's been terrible. But there have been a few silver linings, dare I say. And I think one of the silver linings for the legal industry in particular is that it forced law firms to start thinking about their business model and thinking strategically about where they want to go. When the pandemic happened pretty much overnight, suddenly firms were faced with the fact that maybe their technology support was not where it needed to be. They didn't have enough laptops to allow for remote work, for example. They were faced with suddenly having to figure out a whole new culture. How are they going to service clients? How are they going to retain good people? All sorts of things. So what I have found is the last couple of years, law firms are really starting to think about, well, why don't we really be more strategic about how we grow? Why don't we think a little bit more analytically about how we, what does growth mean for us? What kind of clients do we want? What kind of practice areas do we want to specialize in? How do we want to grow our team? What kind of people are our future leaders? And, to set up goals, objectives, KPIs, things that are kind of new to the legal space, things that businesses have been doing for years. And now law firms are doing it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of market forces. Obviously, you mentioned COVID, but there's other market forces that are really pushing law firms to change old ways. right? There's ALSPs and clients demands, that kind of thing. Are you seeing that that's top of mind for many firms?
What's top of mind? People.
Okay.
Holding on to people.
Oh, interesting.
And so, there's certainly pressures, like you said, the non-lawyer owned legal services providers, certainly, mergers of larger firms, pricing pressures, all sorts of things.
It's an interesting point you make about people, because we read about it right now. There's all the news about the Great Recession. Tell me what you're hearing from firms about that.
So, as I mentioned, that people has become the biggest focus for law firms, in that certainly the Great Resignation affects them. This quiet quitting, which is a really strange concept. They can't really take it for granted anymore that they're going to have enough people to do all the work. So, for example, most of the law firms I've spoken to in the last couple of years had an influx of business. They were very profitable. They did very well, but their biggest problem is they have more work than they can handle, because they are struggling with retaining associates for a number of reasons. And they're also struggling to attract lateral hires. The goal of every firm is to bring over attorneys with experience that have a nice book of business that can meld into their firm. So it's been a big struggle for firms, and it's been, I think, sometimes a distraction really from, okay, how do we go out and get more clients? Well, we're not really thinking about that. We're really more worried about how are we going to service the clients we have. So it's not just employee and retention, it's also client retention.
Yeah. So in the strategic planning process, how can firms address the people factor? How do they go about that in doing the strategic planning?
A couple of T words come to mind. One is trust. Another is transparency. Another is transition. So trust is the most important thing. So if a firm is really serious about thinking about how they want to grow, and thinking very strategically about putting one foot in front of the other, really, about how everything that they do, they have to make sure that everyone trusts each other. There has to be very deep trust among the partners, which sometimes can be a struggle. There also has to be trust among the associates, the non-partner lawyers who are looking to the partners to be leaders in the firm. They have to make sure they have their best interests in mind. And also staff. I mean, they make the magic happen. There's a lot of administrative folks that sometimes struggle with trusting kind of where the direction that the organization is going in, that the lawyers really are going to appreciate the work that they do, and vice versa. So trust is really important. Transparency, as I mentioned, is something that has not always been a theme in law firms. I would say that the legal business has probably not been known as one of the most transparent industries, but that's changing. And the reason for that is because the younger generation, the next gen, wants to know what's going on. Not only do they want to know what's going on, but if law firms really want their people to be engaged and understand, buy into what they do, understand profitability, contribute to the firm, they need to understand how the sausage is made. They need to understand, how do we make money? How do we do things? And many lawyers really just don't know that. They're very focused on what they need to do on a day-to-day basis, which doesn't exactly support the cause, if you will, and really helping the whole firm work together in lockstep towards a common goal. The third thing I mentioned, third T word, is transition. Talking really about succession planning. And that is a big challenge, I think, in a lot of businesses, but I happen to see it a lot in the legal space. And many firms, I think, intellectually understand that they need to think about it, but it's very emotional, Michelle, very emotional, because so many people who have built these firms, it's their baby, they've been doing this forever, it's their identity. And the thought of having to step away from that is scary to a lot of folks, quite frankly. Well, what am I going to do next? What does my next chapter look like? And it's also scary because when you retire, there's a finite amount of money that will be coming to you. It's not like, oh, well, I'll just keep earning in perpetuity. And so those are two roadblocks, I think, sometimes in the succession process. But the succession planning is so important, not only for the future growth of the firm, but also for the security for the rest of the firm, meaning
Right.
the other lawyers and staff. They want to know what's going to be. They want to know
Yep.
what's going to happen, and they want to know what their future looks like, and they need to know, understand, what kind of upcoming transition there might be, what it looks like, leadership change, et cetera.
Yeah, I've always found that fascinating about the legal industry, how so many lawyers really work for a much longer time than I see other professions. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's the old saying that someone's going to die at their desk. It sounds kind of funny and kind of morbid at the same time, but it's true. I mean, and it's the kind of profession that you can actually, you can hold on to a few clients, and you
Yeah,
can kind of work a
right.
few hours a day, which is fine. But that person really shouldn't be leading the firm. They should perhaps move into another counsel position or something like that, where they can still contribute, but they relinquish a lot of the decision making, the control, to the next generation.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways you see law firms getting strategic planning wrong? What are some of the common mistakes that firms are making?
I think the biggest mistake, and it's not just law firms, it's a lot of businesses that engage in the process, is they focus more on the plan, not the process. So they will invest a lot of time and energy and money and emotion into going through the strategic planning process. They get a document that's like yay thick, it goes on the shelf, and then that's it.
Yeah, right.
It happens a lot. So we focus more on the process itself. So it's not just about the plan, but how is it a living document? What is, what are strategic objectives, and who's bought in, and how do we all work together, and how do we assign tasks and action steps and dates, and make sure that the implementation is happening and the momentum is that we're maintaining momentum. It's very difficult because you're working with firms that, time is of the essence, and let's just say time management is probably a struggle for all of us, but also especially for lawyers. And when they're so busy, especially litigators, if they're so busy and they're pulled in a million different directions, it's really hard to commit the time and energy to, okay, let's take the next steps, let's move this along. So a lot of our clients, when they express interest in strategic planning, we want to find out, well, how committed are you? Are you serious about the process? And here's what's going to be involved. And then afterwards, we try to stay involved to make sure that we're pushing the ball along in any way that we can, to make sure that we are focusing on measurable results.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a huge part of it, because it's easy to get lost in the day-to-day of just delivering client service and keeping the ship afloat.
Deadlines.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So, and we know law firms, the law in general is a more conservative, slower to adapt to change. How are you seeing how technology is impacting firms, and does it play a role in this sort of strategy discussion?
It definitely does, because I mean, we at Affinity, we do a lot of technology consulting as well, and focus on improving processes and systems. Many firms will come to us and say that their people are frustrated for whatever reason. They don't like the systems they have. They don't know how to use them. Sometimes it's the system, other times it's the people. And what I mean by that is they're just not properly trained. They're not properly engaged. They don't understand the capabilities of the particular technology they have, or for whatever reason, they're just not interested in it. So, so it absolutely affects this whole process. I mean, there are people who will be so frustrated and have such low job satisfaction because maybe their impression is that the systems aren't there, the technology is not there, so they may move to another firm where they feel like their needs are better served. But oftentimes it's just a matter of understanding what you have, right? And these days you can automate so many processes, but many firms are still relying on kind of like a hodgepodge approach to technology. They'll have a piece of software over here and a system here. They're not talking to each other. So it requires a lot more steps that they need to take. So technology can be friend or foe, right? It can absolutely, I mean, these days it's absolutely essential that you have a really streamlined system and you know what you're doing and you're able to use it and everybody's engaged. But at the same time, it can be really frustrating. Like
Right.
I personally, I mean, I use technology all the time. I don't consider myself a tech person. I get frustrated. I tend towards old-fashioned ways sometimes. Like I'll use it, but maybe I don't use it the best way I should. So fortunately, I get a lot of great training from my company and to learn how to improve myself. But that's not always the case in firms, So
Yeah.
I think it's really important. Technology is just a huge component to this whole process because it's one of the engines, I think,
Yeah.
behind progress.
Well, and it needs to be implemented strategically. I remember someone in the industry telling me, and it wasn't a law firm they were talking about. They're talking about another small consulting firm, and they said it was always the shiniest new platform, and leadership was that there was almost fatigue of being, the employees hearing what's the newest thing they had to learn and figure out, and that was fascinating to me because I've always seen the opposite of where, leadership is sluggish to adopt something, but it can be either way.
It can, and also, I mean, it kind of comes down to the same thing for both is if people are not engaged and owning, their role and understanding really why are we using this system? Why are we trying to grow? Why did we hire this person? Why are we doing? If they don't understand that, it's hard for them to understand their role and how important their role is in the overall success of the firm.
Yeah. So how do you see strategic planning and having that plan, and hopefully it isn't just sitting on the shelf, but having that strategic plan when a crisis hits? So, we've all been through COVID now, but I know there's other crises. So how is that? How have you seen firms either weather a crisis or not weather it very well because of the having or lack of having a strategic plan?
So I'm going to answer that question in sort of a sideways fashion, I suppose. So because of COVID, once upon a time, I think many businesses would say, well, what's the 1-year plan, the 3-year plan, the 5-year plan, the 10, 20-year plan? These days, I say 1 and 3. We don't look beyond that.
Yeah.
Because we all know things change, right? So it's good to say, well, long term, I'd like to do this, but we also know that we have to be nimble. We have to be prepared for anything to happen and have a backup plan. So I think what I've seen with firms is certainly they've invested a lot more in technology. They've invested in cloud technology, getting servers out of their offices, which is risky. Also, thinking about a creative approach to the workspace, right? Because if something happens like a pandemic or really any crisis, if they have a huge lease on a huge office space and something happens, they're stuck. So many firms are starting to think about, well, what's a flexible option? Doing hoteling, figuring out, do we even need to be in an office? So I think that it's affected the way people are planning for the future. But I still see, I mean, we're all aware, but I think it's human nature to sort of say, well, let's just kind of stay in our comfort zone. And I don't know how much crisis planning really law firms can do other than what they're doing right now. I do think it's also really important to focus on culture. If you don't have a really strong culture and something happens, your firm will have a very difficult time weathering the crisis.
Yeah.
And culture is a newer phenomenon, I think, in terms of thinking of it as this sort of entity, right? Like we have to be intentional about it. What is our culture? What is our brand? What do we stand for? Why do we do what we do? How do we care for our people? How do we engage them? That is absolutely vital to the success of any firm. And I would say weathering any crisis that may come their way.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's interesting. The Legal Marketing Association, the Southeastern Conference, the whole theme is culture this year.
That's
so
great.
yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And I think especially on the marketing side, you've got to, often marketers kind of get thrown these things, if the firm's big enough to have a marketer in-house. So they get thrown all the anything to do that's kind of soft, so
I'm
Yeah, it'll be
really,
a fascinating
I'm
discussion.
really happy to hear that they're doing that because I
Mhm.
personally believe that marketing professionals have the responsibility, should have the responsibility of being stewards of the culture.
Mhm.
I mean,
Absolutely.
and I don't think a lot of firms properly utilize and really take advantage of the knowledge that their marketing professionals have
Mm.
in creating this culture because it's really branding. I mean, it's really
Mhm.
the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've also always wondered why HR departments and marketing departments don't sit next to each other and work together because it's kind of the same thing.
It's
So
becoming one and of the same. Absolutely. Well,
it
as
is.
recruiting gets more difficult and
Yeah,
retention, right?
yeah,
And this is how people, through marketing is how they learn what kind of firm this is.
that's
And,
right.
is it the kind of place? Yeah, absolutely. So, and you sort of, you have answered this already, but I want to ask it, how do you know if a strategic plan is sort of strong, but also nimble enough to kind of evolve? And you mentioned, like, look, let's look 1 to 3 years because of, it's so, are there other ways to know, that, look, we've got a strategic plan, but we're still going to evolve and kind of react to market changes?
I think you have to build that into when you're talking about the planning process. You have your goals, excuse me, and you have your strategic objectives. So strategic objectives should be sort of broad enough
Mm-hmm.
that you can apply it to different things that may come your way.
Mm.
Um, it may be something like we want to become the go-to firm in this particular practice area. Okay.
Mm.
Well, there's a lot of ways you can do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe you try spending a lot of money on digital marketing, and maybe it
Right.
doesn't go so well. Okay,
Mm.
well, let's go to plan B. What else can we do? And I encourage firms to think about there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat, right? So
Right.
um, I think that if you have a really strong foundation where you have buy-in from all of the stakeholders and they all
Mhm.
agree, they're all aligned in what they want and their values, um, that's the most important thing. Because if they're faced with, a crisis, or they're faced with something's going sideways or it's not going as well, everybody should be able to come back up together and say, okay, let's regroup. Remember what we talked about before. Remember what's really important to us. This
Right.
particular tactic isn't working. Let's shift to something else. So, like anything else, it really comes down to the trust that people have with each other within these firms to figure out and making sure that they're constantly aligned. And by the way, Michelle, that's not a one-time thing.
Right.
It's something that you have to keep reconnecting,
Mm.
reiterating. You have strategic planning process. You go through this. Many firms will have a once-a-year retreat. Well, that's
Mm.
great, but what's
Mhm.
keeping people connected throughout the year? That's absolutely imperative.
How do you help firms do that? How do you help them kind of stay connected to their strategy?
It depends on the firm.
Mhm.
So I like to definitely set up some kind of a structure. So, for example, I recently worked with a law firm that was having, I don't remember how often they were meeting as partners, maybe quarterly, maybe twice
Mhm.
a year. And they had so many changes going on. I said, you all really should be meeting monthly. So we had a retreat and it was hugely successful. Everyone was thrilled to come together and share. I said, okay, we've got to keep this momentum going. So one of the things that we're doing is we're having monthly partner meetings.
Mm.
Everybody's going to come together. One month you're together in person, the other month you're virtual. So maybe it's a little
Right.
easier. Here's the agenda you're going to follow every single month. It's going to be a revolving facilitator. So somebody gets assigned each particular month and make sure that
Mm.
they stay on task. And then there's going to be follow-up. And it's worked really, really, really well. It's made a huge difference for this particular firm. So I
That's
think,
great.
where we try to help is, I mean, certainly you can lead a horse to water, right?
Mhm.
But we try to share ideas about,
Mhm.
okay, well, here's some structure you can put to this. And if you lay it out and it makes sense to people, also it's helpful when you're in the room with them and you whip out the calendar and you say, okay, let's look at
Right.
dates, let's get it done. It really makes a difference.
Right. Yeah. 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 That's great. So, what else haven't I asked you that you think law firms need to be thinking about from a strategic planning process? Is there anything that we haven't touched on?
We can talk about growth strategy. business development.
Mhm.
Many, many firms that I mentioned earlier are very fortunate, and they have a ton of work,
Yeah.
right now, right? So when we're really busy and things are good and we've got a lot of clients, we go, oh, we don't have to market. We don't have to go out and shake hands, kiss babies. But I cannot underline this enough, and I know you agree with
Yeah.
me. When you're really busy is exactly
When you
when
gotta
you
be
should
doing
be
it.
investing,
Mhm.
because the other shoe always drops. This
Mhm.
this recession that keeps kind of coming
Mhm.
up, we don't know what's going to happen. And it's going to sound silly, but when you're busy and you're successful, you exude confidence and
Mhm.
positivity, and people want to work with you. When
Absolutely.
you're not busy, you will absolutely seem desperate. It's happened to all of us, right?
Absolutely.
So as
Yeah.
silly as
Mhm.
that sounds, it's true. So I
Mhm.
say, even if you're really busy and you've got a lot of pressure on you to bill,
Mhm.
mark time out and look at your business development time, whatever you use it for. And you have to understand that while you may bill $400 an hour to a client, your business development time is actually worth exponentially more. It's not a
Mhm.
waste of time just because you can't bill it
Mhm.
to a client. And you've got to carve it out, and you have to commit to it.
Yeah, I could not agree with that more. It's something that I say often, business development marketing are long-term initiatives. So you don't wait until and suddenly go, oh, you can't just throw a campaign out there and generate business. Especially in professional services,
And it's a
like the law.
cultural
So,
thing.
mhm,
It's a cultural
absolutely.
thing. It's building habit. So it's not just, well,
Mhm,
let's do this initiative. Let's do a PR campaign. It
mhm,
has to be woven into the very fabric of the
yeah,
firm, right?
mhm,
So it's building the muscle. It's saying, well, here's what we're going to do. And you just have to build this habit and know that business development, if you're responsible for origination, business development is just part of what you do on a
right,
daily basis, on a weekly basis. It's just what's expected of you as an attorney.
yeah,
I will add one more thing.
yeah,
Expectations, defining expectations, which is a really big deal. And I think that many firms do not have a path to partnership.
mm,
It's very subjective. Maybe it's not written down, or if it is, it's still very sort of vague and not
mhm,
script. This is a struggle I've seen where younger attorneys want to have a roadmap. They want to
right,
know what's expected of them so that they can measure themselves and that they can aspire to goals. But it's also important for the firm to define what is an ABC firm lawyer. What do
mm,
we expect of our attorneys? What is the approach to billing? What is the approach to client service? What is the approach to culture, leadership? If
yeah,
it's not defined, then how can anyone be judged by it? How can anybody be measured? So
mhm.
this is something that I also reiterate a lot with the firms that I work with.
Yeah, that's really important. Well, thank you so much. This was a fantastic overview of, just the strategic planning process in law firms. And I can imagine it's top of mind with many firms. So we've been talking to Wendy Merrill of Affinity Consulting. So tell our listeners how to get in touch with you, Wendy.
Sure. My email is wmerrill, two R's, two L's, at affinityconsulting.com. Definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very, very active on LinkedIn and would love to connect with all of you. Feel free to reach out and with a question, an idea. I love to collaborate and I love to learn. So would be happy to speak to any of your listeners.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Spill the Ink, a podcast by Reputation Inc. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.